When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Comedy channel. Today's video, we are going to be talking about part 3 of Robert's Rebellion, and we haven't even gotten into Robert's Rebellion yet, so kind of a detailed series, but we're going to be talking about the Defiance of Duskendale in this video. And originally I'd planned, I kind of talked about it in the last part, that I wanted to do the Tourney of Harrenhal and the Year of the Fall Spring in this video as well. But as I was doing my notes, I realized there were just a lot of things I wanted to talk about. And it would feel really weird if the first two parts were like, you know, around 20 minutes or a little below. And then this video came out and it was like 40 minutes. It would just kind of feel really odd for pacing wise of the series. So we're going to just do the Defiance of Duskendale and kind of a little bit of the aftermath in this video. And then next video will be kind of getting into the Tourney of Harrenhal. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow, reach your people that might like this content as well. And let's get into it. So this kind of leads us all into the year of 277 AC. After the last video, we're kind of talking about all the events up to this point. Kind of a summary from last video. Really, we're seeing two different factions are emerging in King's Landing. Very similar to multiple times throughout the series, whether that be with Aegon IV, or you would see with Daeron the Good, or you would see with Rhaenyra and Alicent. We now see that there's like a Aerys faction, and there's a Tywin faction. And so depending on what you were trying to get or achieve, you may go to Tywin, you may go to Eris. And so this kind of gets us to this year in 277 AC, where Dennis Darkland had been wanting a new charter from the crown. And he goes to Tywin initially because, again, a lot of this stuff went to Tywin first. Tywin was really the person dealing with a lot of the small issues, or any of the actual governing of the realm was kind of going through Tywin before it went to Eris. But Dennis Darkland was a little bit clever in the idea that he decides, okay, wait a minute. If Tywin's not going to do it, all I've got to do is go to Eris and say, oh, Tywin denied it, and Eris will back it, because Eris was at a point where he was just going against every single thing that Tywin said or did. And I talked about, again, I would look at last video if you want to really look at why that is, but at this point, Eris had gotten really none of the credit of his reign being so peaceful and profitable for so many people, and just a good time overall for the people. It was all going to Tywin. Tywin was the man gaining all of the credit. He was gaining such a big reputation, while Eris was kind of looked at as just, yeah, he's on the throne, but he doesn't have the actual power. Tywin does. And so that's kind of where a lot of this resentment comes from Aerys. And when we also see Eris, you know, struggling with having children, and specifically Rhaella was actually having problems with children, but Eris is also part of that, you know, watching a lot of his children either die in infancy or be stillbirths. But at this point, Dennis Darkland then stops making payments to the crown. He sees the divide between the two factions and promptly invites Aerys to Duskendale to settle the matters. Now, look at this from Aerys' point of view, right? This is a situation where someone is recognizing that Aerys is the true power, and Dennis Darkland. Now, if Aerys had looked through it and saw, okay, you went to Tywin first, maybe that would have been different, but in this situation, Aerys sees that he controls the power. He can be the person that settles this issue and fixes all of it and gets, you know, the glory and the credit for solving this issue with House Darkland. Now, we know that this is not going to go the way Aerys wants it to, but that's kind of the mindset and the reasoning as to why Aerys would want to do that, right? Again, continue to discredit Aerys that he couldn't handle the situation with Duskendale, but Aerys could. And again, Aerys had not planned to go at all, but Tywin had counseled against him. Again, it comes to this idea that whatever Tywin says, I'm doing the opposite. So Aerys then promptly after this informed his council he would be going to Duskendale to meet with Dennis. And again, this is just going to be one of those moments where Tywin's going to look at it and go, I told you so. Like, what else more do you want me to tell you? I advise you strongly not to do something. You do it to your detriment. And that's going to be one of those things where I think when we get to this point where Tywin is sitting out Robert's Rebellion and he's thinking about really all of the times Aerys has faulted or done something bad to Tywin, it's just these combined things of just not listening to Tywin and feeling unwanted, as well as Tywin seeing an opportunity of how to get Cersei and his line on the throne in general. But we'll get a little bit into that later on with this series. And so Aerys goes to Duskendale with a few men and one of his king's guard, but it was a trap. And all were killed defending Aerys, and he was taken prisoner. Now, I think it's interesting as to why capture Aerys. I don't really understand the rationale here from Dennis Starkland, because in reality, it's a big lose-lose situation. If Aerys, for instance, dies because Tywin tries to take the castle by force or the town by force, well, okay, Dennis is still going to die. If Dennis somehow works out this trade with Tywin that, oh yeah, I'm going to get my charter now, Dennis is still going to die, because as soon as Aerys gets released, he's going to just burn the whole place down and kill you. So I will put it on this point, right? If you're looking at this from Aerys's point of view, Dennis taking Aerys as a prisoner is an incredibly stupid move in so many ways that maybe Aerys could have been thinking at it from that point of view. Like, this guy wouldn't dare take the king prisoner. He doesn't have the forces near enough to even put up a real threat to the crown. He stands to gain really nothing from taking Aerys prisoner. I can kind of see a world in which Aerys thought he was pretty safe in this. And that's going to be something that's going to also conflict into a lot of his issues after this event. But it really is a weird event. Now, the other thing I want to point out here that's very important is, one, you're going to have the freeing up of a Kingsguard spot, which was very important as well. But the other idea here is going to be, okay, people are willing and actively going against the Targaryens. They don't fear the Targaryen name anymore. It doesn't have that power. And that seems very apparent during this time, right? We talked about in the first episode with the War of the Stepstones, with Meleys the Monstrous. We also saw there was a Baratheon rebellion that actually like happened for a second. It wasn't the one we're talking about in this one with Robert's Rebellion, but something else back in the past with Aegon's children and such. But the Targaryen name, in my opinion, just does not have the same weight anymore, right? People do not fear them. And that is going to, like, again, when you look at Robert's Rebellion and why some of these houses are willing to go against the Targaryens, is because they've lost that prestige. Something that we talked about with, say, Aegon the Conqueror was like, you could not go against the Targaryens. They were going to crush you. Now, part of that was because of the Targaryens having dragons. Part of that was because Aegon was such a good ruler, and he understood how to send messages without being like a Maegor, right? And that's kind of been completely lost, right? You have Aegon's sword has been lost to the Targaryens. They don't have the dragons anymore. Eris doesn't seem like the strongest. He's not a warrior king either, so there's not really much to fear there. The whole fear factor is really coming from Tywin, who's not a Lannister, right? So, or who is not a Targaryen. So I think this is very important to understand that people were not really afraid of the Targaryens, in my opinion, anymore. And something else that's going to be very important because of this event is going to be this confirmation bias within Eris, where Eris has already thought people were plotting against him, and they were trying to make Tywin king and all these things. And this is just going to confirm that, right? That people are plotting against him. People are not going under his rule the way they should be. Him being taken prisoner is going to amplify that. It's going to make him more paranoid. It's going to make him more suspicious of all of these plots. Any bad thing that happens, Eris is going to find a way to blame someone because he thinks that they're trying to usurp him, which I talked about so much, where it's like Aerys isn't necessarily wrong and that a lot of people are trying to take power from him. That's just part of being a king, right? So Tywin, for instance, is this person that's very similar to Otto Hightower because he's trying to get as much power for himself as well as getting his family on the throne, right? He wants to create this dynasty for the Lannisters, very similar to the Hightowers during the time of the Dance of the Dragons. It's very, very similar. And so, in a lot of ways, Eris is not wrong, right? When we look at what I talked about in the last video, or really the last two videos and this video specifically, is that there are a lot of factions that could pose a massive threat to Eris and kind of seem like they are. So we come to this pivotal point where Tywin's now really in charge of the Seven Kingdoms. Like, he hadn't been in name because he's not the king, but he'd kind of been in charge for the most part. Now he's fully in charge, right? He is the hand of the king, the second most powerful person. The king is, again, imprisoned. So he is the guy in charge. And I made a whole video and I talked about why Tywin didn't actually just rush Duskendale, because that would have allowed Aerys to die, and then you would have had Rhaegar, who was not married at this point. You maybe could have made that connection there, because Rhaegar would have become king. That could have been something he could have looked at doing. He could have seen this as though, like, if you're Tywin, if you're the reason the king dies, that does damage your image quite a lot. People are going to be murmuring that, oh, did you intentionally want to get Eris killed? So there's a lot of things where Tywin may have just been avoiding some of that bad reputation that was going to go to his name. And that could have heavily impacted Rhaegar wanting to even marry Cersei, just based upon the events that like happen here. Would Rhaegar want to marry Cersei when Cersei's father Tywin is, not really, if he's not the one responsible for Aerys' death, it'd be Dennis Darklyn. But at the same time, he was the one that ordered an attack on it and is the reason Aerys died. So yeah, there's a really like gray area here where it's like, what do the loyalist forces do? What do the Targaryen Lannister alliance, what do they do with the Aerys being captured? Because at this point, I didn't really explain it well, but Dennis at this point is threatening to execute the king at the slightest look of Tywin rushing the castle. And so we come to this, okay, what do we do? No one really does anything. There's a siege for about 6 months, and there's an important moment for the future of the realm here. All of it is in Tywin's hands. And at this point, Barristan sets in motion a daring plan to rescue the king. Eris is rescued, and with this, Dennis flips. Again, he's lost all power. He has his only bargaining chip gone. Dennis begged for mercy, which is like, dude, what do you think's going to happen here? Like, I'm just curious. Like, Dennis Darkling seems like a Balon Greyjoy where he's just an idiot. He doesn't understand how things work. But with this being said, every single member of House Darklyn and Hollard was tortured and then burned alive outside of Dantos. This is the Dantos in the main story, who Barristan wanted spared. Good guy Barristan, as always. And again, we see brutality, a very high extreme from Eris, but at the same time, is this much different than what other Targaryens would have done? These people did commit high treason. They made the king basically a hostage for 6 months. It's an extreme way of killing someone, burning, and then also doing the torturing, but it's not like, Eris went out and just started killing people just because. These people tried basically to hold the kingdoms hostage. What did they expect, right? This is something you would have seen any Targaryen really do. Maybe it would have been a bit nicer. Maybe it wouldn't have been a torture. But it's some of that idea that I don't think Eris is fully gone yet, right? Like, this is not something where I'm like, oh yeah, this is the Mad King here. Because this is what we would have seen a lot of Targaryens do, right? Yeah, I don't know. Let me know what you guys think on, how Eris treats House Darklyn and Hollard. But yeah. Moving on, so this is going to get us to kind of the after effects of the Defiance of Duskendale. What was its like long-term effects or even short-term effects? And like I mentioned, this was really the tipping point for Eris. A lot of his negative qualities that were, present in his earlier life and really amplified more and more as his reign went on, they started to get really bad. Eris started to begin seeing treason everywhere, and he was paranoid to the point that he didn't even leave the Red Keep for 4 years. And again, can you blame Eris, right? Eris goes to Duskendale. It doesn't seem like Eris traveled around the kingdoms very much. You know how we have, for instance, Jaehaerys and Alysanne, they would take their trips around Westeros, seeing all the High Lords and such. Eris doesn't really seem that type. Eris seems like someone that just stayed in King's Landing for the most part. And so you finally go out and you go to try to settle matters yourself, and you get imprisoned for 6 months. I can't really blame Eris for having some of that paranoia. Now, was it self-inflicted? Yeah, Eris is the one that made those bad decisions. And so Eris seeing treason everywhere to me is interesting because, again, I can't necessarily fault him for that. The issue is how he reacts to it, how he lets it take over his brain, Because the thing is, as a king, you are going to have people that are trying to make advances, that are going to try and be gaining things off of you. Just look at Aegon the Fourth, for instance. It's a perfect representation of that. Even House of the Dragon with Viserys, right? Early on, his kind of arc was how he hated being king because everyone always wanted something from him. That's, I think, a lot of what Aerys is feeling, and it's being amplified because of the personal experiences that he's had. Aerys began to turn on even Rhaegar. So we kind of now have a third faction. So we have kind of the Aerys faction. We now have kind of the Rhaegar faction. And we also start to have the Tywin faction. So again, we have three real factions now in King's Landing, where it's like there's some people at this point that, are still loyal to Aerys and probably are just trying to get things from him. There's this faction with Rhaegar who see that Rhaegar is probably going to be a better king. He should be the one in charge. Eris is kind of going down the loopy end. And then you have the people that are just like kind of loyal to Tywin. So this would be people like Pycelle, for instance. And something I literally mentioned when we were talking about Duskendale, but Eris had believed that Tywin and Rhaegar had conspired to rush Duskendale, to have him killed, to put Cersei on the throne next to Rhaegar. Which, again, from Eris's point of view, I really don't think that's a bad observation, because logically, from Tywin's point of view, that's not a bad plan, and it would fix a lot of the issues with the Lannister Targaryen dynasty. Now, the big question would be, at this point, was Rhaegar willing to do something like that? And I just don't think the answer is yes. So I don't think that's bad observation. I don't think that's Eris being over paranoid. I think that's a logical conclusion to maybe come to. I think that was a possibility. And so at this point, right, we're kind of at a breaking point for the Tywin and Eris relationship, and enters a fourth player. And the fourth player is Steffon Baratheon, the father of Stannis and Robert. We also had talked about him a little bit in the first episode with, again, Aerys, Steffon, and Aerys, or Aerys, Steffon, and Tywin were like a good trio in the War of the Stepstones, the Nine Penny Kings. So to me, it's interesting because you can kind of see that Aerys is looking for someone else that he can trust. And when you look at Steffon Baratheon, who has not been at court at this point, he is someone that you would assume would still be loyal to Aerys, again, being a childhood friend. And Steffon Baratheon is put into the small council. And a lot of people start to begin to murmur that this was kind of Aerys's backup plan. Aerys had planned to get rid of Tywin, to imprison him, execute him for treason, all of these things, and make Steffon Baratheon the new Hand of the King. And this doesn't really seem like a bad idea when you look at the point of Steffon Baratheon really didn't have a lot of these impulses, I guess, to gain power and things of that nature. And Tywin was someone that was trying to climb that ladder. But I think why this would not have gone well if he had just straight up executed Tywin is you would have gone into war with the Lannisters. And when you had a lot of other factions at this point that were like, they weren't buddy-buddy with the crown, I don't know if that would have worked well. I think Aerys was going to the extreme. I think Aerys, if Aerys was just planning to replace Tywin and just bring in Steffon Baratheon as Hand of the King instead, that's a good move, right? Tie the Baratheons closer to your house without actually marrying into them or anything like that, and reinforcing that friendship, very important. And even like when you look at this point of, okay, let's say Aerys, like this was just a rumor and that Aerys actually had not planned to replace Tywin at this point, which I think is very unlikely. You're again strengthening your bonds of your alliances, right? That big three. So I really like kind of that idea from Aerys. I don't think it was a bad move at all. So Aerys sends Steffon Baratheon then to find a wife of pure Valyrian blood for Rhaegar. Again, Aerys was kind of a old school Targaryen purist type of guy. He wanted to keep the blood pure, more or less. And this is kind of a big move because it shows the trust Aerys has in Steffon Baratheon that, you know, I'm putting you in charge of finding the future king's wife. Like that's a lot of, you know, pressure and trust. And that's something that a lot of people note did not go to Tywin, or even it didn't even go to Rhaegar himself to find a wife. It went to Steffon Baratheon, which I found is very interesting. But unfortunately, this would backfire for Aerys, as Steffon would die on his return journey within eyesight of his sons Robert and Stannis Baratheon. With this, Aerys could no longer replace Tywin, as he believed that Tywin has somehow killed Steffon. and would kill him too. From this point forward, Eris would only meet with Tywin, with all 7 Kingsguard present. And this kind of gets us to the year of the false spring and the tourney of Harrenhal. But again, importantly, something else to think about here is that this mission is just so detrimental in so many regards because, one, it eliminates a very close ally for Eris, someone that Eris could trust, which he really didn't have at this point. It also kind of severs that tie with the Baratheons, right? Eris doesn't know Robert, doesn't know Stannis. And so you've kind of now lost that alliance, right? So that's kind of the downside of not having the Baratheons tied into your family through marriage at this point, right? I know they had in the past, but they weren't like immediately like tied together at this point. And so now you're left with a really difficult decision. You know, for Eris, who do you marry Rhaegar to? And that's something that I think is really awkward. I think the arrangement of Rhaegar and Elia was just a very weird marriage, given all of the other potential marriage partners and even the rationale like he had used for why Cersei shouldn't be Rhaegar's wife and other people. So yeah, I find this very interesting. It's a very interesting time, and one of the most important events is Stefan Baratheon dying here, because how would things have gone differently if that wasn't the case, right? Like, how could things have changed? Because I don't think there's a way that Eris calls for Robert's head if Stefan is still loyal to the crown. If Stefan had become Hand of the King, I think it's very likely Robert would have been called to court. And so how would that have impacted all of Westeros? Could have been really interesting. But thank you guys all for watching. Let me know what you guys think about a lot of the topics I brought up in this video. Again, sorry for you guys that were wanting the Tourney of Harrenhal, but as you guys can see, we're already like 20-ish, 22 minutes into the video. A bit longer than I want these parts to be. So yeah, I just had a lot to talk about, and I hope you guys all enjoyed. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.